Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today it's time for another client lesson update. And hopefully the audio is okay. I'm trying to use the new camera, not using a Bluetooth mic, but hopefully this is better. Hopefully I can keep that sound from the freezer drowned out behind me. But today I thought I would chat with you guys a little bit about setting up bands, and one of the biggest problems I run into with clients, and I think this can just be demonstrated here with me holding pegs and bands, rather than try to hook up onto my rack, because what people need to remember is that everyone has a different rack. And one of the things I notice is that my clients, in general, have a steep learning curve with bands. And it seems to be independent of who they are, how intelligent they are, or anything else. Even people who are very, very intelligent, with great careers and everything else, they struggle with setting up bands. And it's because people don't grasp that no matter what you're doing with your band setups, when you are squatting and deadlifting, squatting and benching, one hand into the band, this loop like this is the only thing that should be attached to the bar. Okay? There should never be a loop over the top with the two pieces down. You should never be looping two ends into there. And the reason for that is that the tension tends to get extremely high, much higher than the rated tensions on the bands, and bands tend to break when you do that. And that's well and good until you have 50 pounds of band tension and one of them breaks on one side in the middle of the max squat. Okay, you're going to get hurt when that happens. And unless you have ways to measure the band tension, you don't know how much tension you're getting once we start looping bands over like this, okay, double ways. You have no way to measure it, because band tensions from the manufacturers assuming you're stretching the band long ways like this. Okay, so this band is part of a 30-pound set. This is a 15-pound band. Okay, and I have multiple sets of these, multiple sets of 15s, 50s, 65s, 100s. I have well in excess of 200 pounds of band tension, actually well over 300 pounds if I want it available. But for those two lifts, because of the range of motion involved and because we're not pulling them directly off the floor, we generally want an L shape. Okay, so whatever's going on with the bottom here, you want this run in such a way that it's just pulling one end. And what do I mean by an L? Well, if you have a band peg looped on one end, it would be something like this. Let me see if I can even just set them fairly short. Okay, so where we have the band length and then the two bands at the bottom, these forming an L shape with the band. It should not be a V and it should not be a triangle. Now, you can do a triangle type for benching if you have a base that has a really, really wide base at the bottom, in which case, this is the bar, and it could look like this, okay? That's different. That's not looping this whole thing over the top, okay, which will absolutely eventually break your bands. You will break your bands within 1 month doing that. If you're training with them once a week, you will break your bands. And again, you have no way to measure the tension. So what we're generally trying to do, whether you're using a pair of dumbbells to anchor at the bottom and you're looping this through one dumbbell, which again, this could represent the dumbbell handle, and then you can loop it under another dumbbell and then bring it up. Okay, you can set those, but you usually need them touching each other because this one's going to pull on the other, so you might need to set two dumbbells side by side, you might need three. And the thing to remember is that if you're going to run multiple bands, and usually if you're at a commercial gym without good band pegs, don't buy big, thick bands. Buy these mini bands, because you're going to need a different pair of dumbbells for every single band. So if you hook two bands to one side of the bar, you're going to need a separate dumbbell set for each of those. And yeah, so if you're running a pair of bands on each side for 4 bands, it's going to be like 8 dumbbells you're going to need to set up if that's the route you're trying to go. And it's the only way it's going to be stable. And if you're using band pegs or whatever, and it's hard to believe that most people out there go to commercial gyms that don't have holes in the base for a band peg, like with a big rack. It's the norm. It's the norm. Now, the other thing that's of benefit in a lot of racks, if you're squatting, whether it's a squat rack whether it's a big rack, you can oftentimes choke the band around other arms at the bottom. Like if you have an open base type rack with a big legs running along the bottom, because it's not just 4 posts, they're connected some way. If it's not bolted all the way as a solid piece to the ground, if it's a 4-corner with an open base, you can just choke the band around that. So you can go underneath that arm at the bottom, and you can just choke it up like this. Just choke it through, and you have the end of the band for squatting. If you have a rack that has band pegs already installed, use them. You have to learn to use the band pegs to set the length. Because what we want to do with this is that when you're at the very bottom with the range of motion, you want to have just a little tiny amount of tension. You do not want this band to be stretched, but you don't want it flopping, right? You don't want the band flopping, you just want a little bit of tension. So you set all of your tensions at the bottom accordingly. You don't want a lot of tension though, and the reason for that, bands tend to hit peak tension very, very quickly. So if you're using a 50-pound band set, a lot of times when you're squatting, that band set hits 50 pounds before you're even halfway up. If you just have a little tension at the bottom, when you are midway through the rep, you're going to hit the full thing. It's not like chains. Chains increase linearly with length because as you go, more and more weight is added sequentially. And if chains are set up right, for every inch that you add to the, as you travel on the way up through the range of motion, it's adding the same amount of weight for every inch of chain that's coming off the ground. With bands, that's not the case. Bands reach nearly peak tension usually within halfway of your rep. So a 50-pound band set, you're using 300 pounds plus 50 pounds of bands, you're hitting 350 before you're anywhere near the lockout. You're usually hitting it halfway through the rep if you're set correctly. Okay, and it might be 348 and then you pick up 2 more pounds over the last foot or 2 feet of the range of motion depending upon what lift you're doing. So that's the way they tend to work. Whereas when you're deadlifting, you can loop them over the top because you're close to the floor. This isn't stretching as far, so you can put these 2 on band pegs and just pull that way. But the thing to remember is that increases the tension about 50 to 55%. So if you're using a 50-pound band set where you do form a V over 2 pegs, and this is up at the top of the bar, just over the bar, because it's looped over this way, it's about a 50 to 55% increase. So a 50-pound band set turns into 75 plus pounds. 75 is as much as close to 80 pounds, right? Well, 55%. So again, another 5%, 2.5. So it's going to be about 75 to 78 pounds. So again, that's a different setup. But you could do the same thing where you could form a V, or a triangle, where you just have one end up, but that tends to actually produce a much lower one just because of, again, the nature of not stretching it very far on a deadlift. It's a very short range of motion. All of our tension is down at the bottom. It tends to not actually hit the full band tension, and it's usually in that case about 80% of the advertised tension. So again, a 50-pound band set tends to be about 40. But the thing is that people have to remember when you're looping them up, you have to find a way to rig the bottom, whether you're choking it or wrapping it around a post and then choking it. And that's one of the other things. If you're benching with bands and your gym has a rack that has an open base and you don't have a bunch of band pegs, you can use those arms at the bottom of the open base on the bench press. Also just drag a bench in there. It's just that you might have to loop it over twice. So it might end up looking like where you loop it over once and then you may have to come through and choke it through again. So something like this, right? So that you shorten some of this out and you take the extra band out so that we're back to this tension, and this will still give you correct tension. It will still give you very close to advertised tension on a band. But again, people tend to get very confused with this, but the goal needs to generally be, particularly for squatting and benching, for only one end of the band to be hooked to the bar. Okay, that doesn't mean it doesn't go in the middle. You don't have 2 ends hooked up and then on something at the bottom. It needs to be one end. So you're either going to have this bottom formed into an L shape with pegs or dumbbells, or you're going to have it wrapped around something fixed to the rack so that you can shorten it to the desired length. So again, one end attached should be slightly taut at the bottom, not stretched, but just taut to where this isn't, flopping around. And then it stretches. And if you're setting them up any other way, you're probably doing it wrong. You're probably creating a curve that you can't measure. You have no idea what you're doing, and you're potentially risking injury and just snapping your bands. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.